Hello, this is Pastor Matthew Woods from Grace Lutheran Church in New Albany, Indiana, and this is the weekly devotion for Monday, September 13, 2021. The lessons we have learned. So the question is, do you learn from your mistakes? Is it possible that you can learn from your tragedies? Is it possible for something good to happen from tragedy? This last week, we were reminded of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. So today, I'd like to talk about some of the things that we have learned because of it. So for today's text, I thought we'd use Matthew chapter 7, 24 through 27, which is part of the Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Actually, it wraps up Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. Jesus says in verse 24, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it has its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Now, this last weekend, many programs were talking about 9/11. One of the programs that we caught talked about the things we had learned from 9/11. The collapse of the World Trade Center buildings, the towers, and all of their horror have also given a better future to buildings they have put up. As an example, the new World Trade Center that's there now. One example is fire resistance and structural integrity, which are intimately tied together. When the planes hit the towers, temperatures quickly reach 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I would imagine it'd actually be more. But as the steel beams were exposed to that heat, it was eventually caused the steel to buckle and eventually give way. When the remaining supports could no longer hold the weight of the building, it collapsed in on itself and then cascaded down. Interestingly enough, one of the artifacts, by the way, related to this, on Ground Zero, was a King James Bible. It was cradled literally inside a piece of melted steel. Inside the metal was melted around it. Amazing. It was found by a firefighter that was sifting through the rubble in March 2002. And the pages were open, believe it or not, to Matthew chapter 5, 38 through 39. It was the King James Bible. It says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." Sort of interesting find, right? And it's amazing the Bible didn't burn up. It's a miracle. And then to have the steel melt around it is amazing. And of course, the passage is not lost on people either. It's sort of interesting as well. But to find that Bible in such a form, that's amazing, especially with all that heat. Anyway, in the new World Trade Center, the one they've built, steel is now covered with high-strength concrete because they've learned that concrete can withstand the heat much longer. And this is not just to normal concrete like you'd put on your driveway, 3,000, 5,000 pound. No, this stuff goes all the way up to 30,000 psi with high-grade steel rebar and steel fibers that are mixed into the concrete to make it even stronger and tougher. The steel fibers bond with the concrete to prevent the spreading of any cracks. They just don't go as far because of an explosion or an extreme force or fire. They just simply take the hit. Another important thing that they have learned has to do with stairwells. They talked about stairwells in the Twin Towers being too narrow for the people. In fact, they had to descend single file, and that slowed everything down. So much so that it took, in some cases they were mentioning on these shows, a half an hour to go from these floors way up top all the way to the bottom. And it was very difficult for the firemen to come up the other side. So what they have learned is that the new stairwells are twice the size, and they are boxed in with 3 foot thick, 3 foot thick walls of concrete. And not only, and unlike the Twin Towers, they're not concentrated in the middle of the building, but spread around the building so that at least there's an option to go to if you need to escape a fire. So they've learned a lot structurally about these buildings. Now, the Pentagon was another interesting thing they talked about. It was actually already under renovations on 9/11, and more importantly, by some miracle, the section they had already done was where the plane had hit the Pentagon, where they'd done these refits already. So when the plane hit, the damage was actually minimized. Concrete walls, what they're doing is the concrete walls are covered with membranes of some kind of polymers, I guess. But if it explodes, it doesn't shatter. Pieces of it don't go everywhere. They did the same thing with the windows, covered the windows so that if there's an explosion, it'll take the hit, it'll shatter, but it won't splinter in all these different directions. Therefore, the shrapnel will not fly all over the place and it won't kill people, so it saves more lives. So they've learned this also. So these are some of the structural lessons they have learned from the tragedy of 9/11. Some good has come from it. They have been learned through a careful study of what happened that day by observing all the things that went wrong, all the failure, all why it failed. The engineers have learned to build better and safer, which is good news. The same can be said about airport security or national security. They have learned a lot in 20 years and learned a lot because of 9/11. No one could have imagined people hijacking a plane with a box cutter or turning it into a missile. So they have reinforced the doors so they can't get in there. You know, the pilots have a better chance at maintaining control of the plane. Things like that. And if you've ever been in an airport recently in the last 20 years, you know that security remains a very important thing at the airports. So we turn to the Sermon on the Mount and what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 7. The Sermon on the Mount is teaching us important spiritual lessons to build on. Jesus has a way that is different and much more effective, surpassing that of the righteousness of the Pharisees, who were quite honestly on sinking sand with their teachings. Often he used the formula, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." For example, you have heard it said, "Do not murder," but I say to you that anyone who hates his brother is subject to judgment. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery," but I say to you that a man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. In regard to oaths, don't make them. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Very different way that Jesus is teaching here, but it is a better way to build your spiritual life. By doing these things that Jesus teaches, we'll be building that better spiritual life, and that's what he's after. These improvements surpass the superficial ways of the Pharisees, just the outward appearance of being spiritual. The winds and the waves will not shake our faith or destroy it. The winds will blow and the waves will hit, but it will not come down with a great crash. It's like remaining vigilant against the terrorists. We are to guard our hearts from being invaded by lust or invaded by anger or greed or dishonesty. The key is to be aware of where they are and never letting them in. It's not enough to keep up appearances. It's something that must be put into practice. It's something that must be real. But when these things are put into practice, Jesus says it's like building a house on a rock, and it does not fall, regardless of the winds and the waves that hit it. It's been my experience that the most significant lessons are often learned from heartbreak or failure. Experience is often a cruel teacher, built on previous sins or poor decisions. What if we could go back? What if we could go back and meet our younger selves and teach them the wisdom that we have gained over the years? Would you do it? Where would you start? What would you start with? I'm curious. Yeah, there's a lot I would tell my younger self. But then again, much of the wisdom I have gained has come from learning from my own personal failures. In my Taekwondo days, when we would compete, I'd often learn more from defeat than a win. A defeat usually caused me to examine what had happened much more closely, why my opponent beat me. Likewise, the things that caused my heart to burn or my brain to spin or my conscience to swirl were the things that always left the deepest mark, the biggest lessons, the biggest impressions on me. I'm not saying that this is the only way to learn important lessons, but some of the best wisdom comes from things that go wrong. And that's just part of life, just the way things are. But it's important that we actually learn. And thankfully, by the grace of God, I'm forgiven for such things, and I can learn. By the grace of God, I can take such lessons and rebuild using better spiritual materials, like the ones Jesus hands out in the Sermon on the Mount. I can take that wisdom that I have gained and build something more solid. Now, we can expect to fail, fall, do something stupid once in a while. It's part of the human existence. But in Jesus, we can also know that better is possible. Jesus brings something better in the wisdom of his word. We can be smarter because of it. And because in Jesus, even our worst moments can be remade into something that God can bless and even call good, we have hope. Just ask the Apostle Paul or Peter, who know all about learning from their failures. May the Lord bless us in the same way they were blessed, so that our shortcomings can be turned into reasons to praise our Savior, the one who turns crucifixions into resurrections. And so the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with his favor and forever and always give you his peace in Jesus. I'm Pastor Woods. Thanks for being with us this week. God bless you all. Thanks for being with me. Bye-bye.